As we have been reporting this week, there has been a lot of outrage over the way a security guard at a Winnipeg Dollarama brutalized an alleged shoplifter. Both the guard and alleged shoplifter are now facing charges. For more on this latest incident involving a security guard, our Truth and Politics panel are here. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan, Jennifer, thanks for being with us. Niigaan, we'll start with you, and the video is graphic and disturbing. We don't know what happened before, but your thoughts on this latest incident involving a security guard?
Well, yeah, right. The video is horrific. It's horrific because of a number of things. One is that there's obviously clearly a very violent situation that's been created and that's being dealt with such a harsh amount of violence in either return or in relation to or reaction to. There is the kind of situation here doesn't just begin out of nowhere. So let's be clear. There was probably some kind of precipitating event involving a conflict between the security officer and the individual. But none of this warrants this kind of reaction. None of this warrants a kind of way in which people are using weapons, and weapons that are often illegal, to react in this situation. So this individual, my understanding is that they are facing charges and for having perpetuated this situation as a security guard, and I think deservedly so.
Jennifer, this isn't the first time we've talked on this panel about the treatment of Indigenous peoples by security guards, and these are only the incidents that get caught on camera. How bad do you think the problem actually is?
I think it's getting worse, and I think as poverty increases, especially around the country, even hearing in Saskatchewan that we have one of the worst poverty rates for children, is we're going to start seeing people, within these stores that are cheaper, like Dollarama, dollar stores, things like that, that are fighting to survive. And as that increases, I think, there's an uptick in the way that security is approaching things like this, but there's also that big gap of the cultural awareness piece as well. And regardless of where anybody stands on these issues, police officers, security officers, all of those things are not supposed to be there to, be unleashing these type of attacks on any individuals. If you're there to protect the store from being, from theft and things like that, fine. But I think the type of actions that we saw out of the security officer are completely unwarranted and should never be happening. And especially if they're obtaining things like brass knuckles and things that are, not allowed to be kept on anybody. So, yeah.
Niigaan, there are calls for changes to the way security guards are licensed and trained in Manitoba. The government signaling that could be coming. Would that help the situation?
There's two main problems. The first is that the training of security officers, while prescribed by a manual by the province of Manitoba, really doesn't have any kind of cultural expectations or certainly clear training when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples. For many security firms, they're working in direct contact with Indigenous peoples who are sometimes in very precarious circumstances. You need a very specific set of skills. You need to have knowledge of what you're dealing with, and you are being thrust into a situation that's been created well before you. Secondly, we have a huge problem in Manitoba of what they call temporary certification. Up to 6 months before you can actually go through that training that I just spoke about before, which has various different circumstances, because there is no prescribed or clarification on what that Indigenous training should be. It just ends up being a lot of ramshackle stuff. But even before that, you can get a temporary license without the expectation that you're going to do your training eventually, but be on the job, be at the front line, and have no training at all, like almost nothing. It is completely preposterous that you would be putting people into situations, never mind those officers who are completely now incapable of dealing with situations, but also that the public is now endangered because these people are not trained appropriately.
Jen, you kind of touched on this, but do you think culturally sensitive training could also improve the situation with some pretty blatant stereotyping?
I think for sure. I think it's become pretty obvious now that there are stereotypes that exist, especially for our people, even our own people that have made jokes about this on social media, that like you can't go into certain stores because you're going to be followed. I think as those stereotypes start to increase, those security officers that have that lack of understanding and that lack of training will automatically view us as a problem. And when that happens, we're seeing even the way that they approach us and the way that they are approaching issues like we saw in that video, where almost that dehumanization component, where like that security guard appeared to have no empathy or no level of like wanting to even diffuse the situation. It just seemed to get worse and worse and worse. And yeah, I think that some cultural sensitivity training is definitely needed, and also an understanding of like, if you're working in stores like that and the poverty around you is increasing, people are often not stealing just for the fun of it. A lot of it has to do with, again, what I said, survival.
Right. Jennifer Niigaan, we'll leave it there. We're going to continue the conversation about Jordan's principle and a vote of non-confidence in the Alberta government over on the podcast. Thanks to you both.
Very much.
Thanks.
Niigaan, moving to Jordan's principle, and last week the Minister of Indigenous Services, Mandy Galmasti, announced $1.5 billion for Jordan's principle, which is set to last until 2027. It sounded like a lot of money, but according to reporting by our Karen Pugliese, it's far less than what is being spent or has been spent in recent years. Your thoughts on that?
It isn't a lot of money. This is a problem that's been created by the federal government because when Jordan's principle came in, there was no parameters set to it. And perhaps it was a situation in which the government didn't want to put parameters on that. Those funds in which, what would keep children out of the child welfare system? What would deal with the traumas and the illnesses that come out of the situations of poverty which lead children into the child welfare system? How do we bring children, Indigenous children, up to par with all the Canadians? I mean, really, the sky's the limit. I mean, where do you begin? So I understand why the federal government didn't put parameters on this funding, but the problem is when you try to play catch up later, when you say too much money is going out the door because we're bringing Indigenous children up to the point of equality, then it's very difficult to turn the floodgates off. And this isn't a lot of money comparatively with what have been approved previously under Jordan's principle. Never mind the fact that there have been approvals that are still not yet fulfilled, and this money will go to that. This is a situation that the government has created, but also that the government really has to fulfill and has to finish. And then maybe we can look at to the point where we look at some parameters around Jordan's principle. Jordan's principle, though, needs to be maintained. It's not something the government can just walk away from. And I think that the government would very much like to walk away from this issue. And so if you look at the ways in which the government was moving towards, they're looking at not funding anything at all. And so this is in direct reaction to chiefs and communities and families that have called to and say, you must deal with Jordan's principle funding, which has funded TAs in schools, massive, huge mental health programs, huge situations of people with prosthetics, for example. My point is that the government would like to walk away from this, and instead of walking away from it, put stringer methods on that that are Indigenous led, and do that immediately. Work now on that, because when this money runs out, we're going to need some kind of way for this program to continue.
Jen, the funding announced by the minister was meant to reassure families who rely on Jordan's principle. Do you think that was accomplished?
I think a little bit of both. I think people were happy to see the announcement, but I did read the article that APTN put out talking about how internal documents show that this is, falling tens of millions of dollars short. But I think, this also goes back to what we were hearing about earlier last year, with there being a lot of applications also going through that might not necessarily should have been put through Jordan's principle. So I think, those parameters do need to be established. And I think if we utilize those resources a lot more effectively, we could see them go a lot longer of a way. But I do think that the government does need to commit to a more stable and secure funding model for Jordan's principle, and then outline those parameters and start training people effectively, especially Jordan's principle workers on nations that are, having to put all of these requests through. And when there's shortfalls in other areas, that's where you see them go through. So it's not always that, our people are just submitting things that might not be eligible. It might also be used as a Band-Aid in other areas where those resources don't exist.
Niigaan, moving on to the situation in Alberta now, where Chiefs unanimously passed a resolution of non-confidence in the Alberta government over its, quote, inability to responsibly and respectfully govern the province of Alberta. Chief cited the separatist movement. Your thoughts on that vote?
Well, it's almost like this is a statement that had to be delivered, because what ends up happening is people like Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, will say, this chief said to me at this meeting that I approve this project and I'm on board for this project. And if you look at it, the federal government's actually very similar in the way that they operate there. They say, we're going to offer loans, guaranteed loans for programs for people to buy into mines, pipelines, whatever the project may be. It becomes very nefarious, very vague. And what First Nations in Alberta are doing is they're becoming very clear with saying that separatism is not on the table. And it was all fun and games when it was like newspaper headlines, petitions. But now what's happening is that the Alberta Premier is starting to openly muse about picking recommending to the federal government that they get to pick their own judges, who then make their own decisions based on whatever Alberta decides on a whim this week, according to the populist vision that will keep Danielle Smith in office. And it just happens to be right now that separatism, mostly disenfranchisement with the days of Justin Trudeau, which is carryover, you're actually seeing that separatism in Alberta is reducing. It's loud over a few people who are generally making websites or trying to profit off of that kind of sentiment. And is every province unhappy with Ottawa? Yeah, all the time. But separatism in Alberta is a far-fetched dream for anyone who wants to pursue that vision. It's not a realistic way to move forward. Not only is it unconstitutional, it's illegal, it also will violate the treaties. And I'm sure that Alberta doesn't want to restart the treaty process. And never mind the fact that, we have now university professors trotting out saying that Alberta could act as a proxy for the Crown. Whatever. Let's stop this nonsensical discussion. And I think what the Chiefs are doing is saying, let's stop playing and let's get down to the real business of what it means to build an economy here in Alberta, which we all know, oil prices, the situation of resource development. I mean, Alberta's in a bit of a economic downturn, and there's some real problems on the table.
Only 8 months or so to go, Niigaan, before the vote, so I'm sure it won't be going away. But Jen, your thoughts on this non-confidence vote, and could it mean anything for Danielle Smith and her government?
I don't think it's going to mean anything in the logistical side of these are not elected MLAs, but I think on the other side, this shows that there's a pretty big fractured relationship between the Premier of Alberta and her party and First Nations, which is never a good thing. You want to be working together and you want to see that you have those relationships, because at the end of the day, we're in nation to nation, meaning that those First Nations chiefs sit at that level where they should be able to work with you as the Premier of your province. And I think what this is saying is we don't have the confidence to work with you, and stop with the separatism talks. And until that happens, and until she's publicly denouncing a lot of that, you're going to see more of this.
All right, you two will leave it there for this week. Jen, feel better. Thanks to you both.
Thanks.
Yeah, me glad.